Part 2. Jude. Chapter 18. Jude's head felt thick and slow. A scratchy cloth was pulled across his face that made it hard to see. He inhaled deeply a few times and almost drifted back to sleep. The smells were unfocused, but he sorted through the faint signatures: people, blood, propellant, solvents, and oil. Mostly it smelled like the bottoms of lots of shoes. The ground was humming brownly and rocking slightly. There was a high, rapid, crunchy noise beneath him, along with the muffled sound of very fast air. A box! Jude was in a moving box. He remembered getting in one with Cassia. He inhaled again, searching for her signature in the air, but couldn't detect it. He concentrated on the signature of the blood across his clothes, and was relieved it wasn't hers. But his heart kept bumping faster in his chest and neck. Where was she? He twisted, trying to see out of the cloth, and realized that his hands and feet were locked together. How? He inhaled again for the more subtle shapes around him, and picked up on the presence of sticky plastic. The last time his hands had been locked together was with metal, and it was because Dr. Collett had been angry at him. Was he angry again? Jude smelled for Dr. Collett, but couldn't detect him either. He needed to find Cassia. She would know what to do, even though she was sick. She was really smart. Also, Jude needed to tell her to get out of the boxes. Some of the burnt propellant was leaking into the air and would make her sicker. Somebody, forward and to the left of him, started speaking. There was a spiny crackle, and then an even fuzzier voice answering. Jude drew another breath in. There was only one person, despite the two voices, and he didn't recognize the signature or the slightly faded subsignatures writing on him. Someone new. With 3 more breaths, Jude tied down the memory of his scent. It had a sort of round shape, but with a grainy texture and tiny lights all in a row. The tiny lights were the smell of being nervous. They were in Jude's own scent, too. The moving box turned, and there were little colored sounds of things that rolled and clinked together. Jude scrubbed his head across the humming ground, trying to pull off the cloth. It would help to see since the smells and sounds weren't making enough sense. He couldn't get the cloth off, but it wasn't very long until the moving box stopped moving. He could hear the outside noise better, but hadn't known air could be so loud. It was whining, hollow and high, but also roaring, wide and low. Both shapes were muffled once the person left, slamming the box shut with an opaque rectangular bang. 2 more new people were talking outside of the box. Jude was concentrating on memorizing their unique smells when the pieces to the door above him swung open after crooked squeaking clicks. The roaring noise flooded in as hands dragged Jude out. One hand pulled the cloth up on his head. Jude's eyes were too overwhelmed with light to focus, but he heard one of the new people shout over the air's noise, "Interception confirmed, over." The fuzzy voice answered after the spiny crackle again. "Copy, hold for transport." "Where's Cassia?" Jude asked, trying to be heard over the loudness. One of the new men hit Jude across the mouth, and the second new man grabbed the first's arm and yelled, "Not his face, you idiot!" He pulled the cloth back down. Their scents got larger. They were angry. The low roaring and the high whining shapes were overlapped by an approaching fan-like sound that chopped the air into sections. Jude tried to think back on how he had gotten into the moving box in the first place. He had only managed to remember being with Cassia in a different one, when she had the air machine on her face. These were not safe people, and he could tell something was wrong by how his tiny lights were multiplying, but Jude didn't know how to fix it. He was locked together with the sticky plastic, and he wasn't supposed to talk. A smell like a long tilt released as a case was unclicked and a cap unthreaded. It was the same sleep-out drug he'd been given after Dr. Collett had taken Cassia away before she came to his hab. Jude twisted his head to its source, afraid that the sleep was meant for him again. He tried to bend away from it. Hands pushed him down. "Please, no," Jude cried. He didn't need sleep. He needed Cassia. One of the new men, his signature now identifiable as a waxy sideways point, lifted the cloth at his neck, then pinched him with the needle. Jude grunted, then collapsed. Chapter 19. Jude was put in a new type of hab. He was even given a new name. There were new handlers, new techs, a new director, and new work. It was very confusing at first, but he learned that his work was to smell tiny, twitchy, white things. Mice. He had never seen mice before, though he remembered their zigzag smells writing on shoes. When Jude grew brave enough to ask for Cassia at the mouse lab, the techs ignored him. He waited for another day, growing full of tiny lights, then asked again. They told him that Cassia didn't work here and to stop asking. His own scent inflated. He was angry, upset. How could he fix it? When Cassia was upset, she would act different until it made change. Jude decided to try for himself. First, he slept in the shower, like she had. Unfortunately, the water only turned on for a few minutes every day, so his clothes dried off before morning, and nobody seemed to mind. His next plan was to stop eating. The new hab always had a box of food packets available, and nobody watched Jude to make sure he ate, so it took a few days for the mouse place handler to notice. Jude's arms and legs became heavy, and his stomach bit him from the inside, but he didn't stop. Another few more days made the mouse place director upset too, which finally made change. Daniel, I need you to eat, she told him after he had passed out during work. He had been smelling mice for oxytocin, which were flashy sideways bars, and cortisol, which tinted a whole signature darker. Then he had fallen over. Jude shook his head, which made the scoops of green and red dots inside it flash painfully. He was tired, sitting on his new hab's bed, feeling blurry. His signature had a lot of deficiencies. What kind of food do you want? She asked gently. I want Cassia, Jude returned, exhausted. He thought about her hair in his fingers, her kisses on his mouth, and the flashy sideways bars they shared while playing catch. Who is Cassia, Daniel? Was she your handler? The director guessed. Cassia is my mate, Jude answered, and a rash of blue freckles broke out in the director's scent. He had smelled those before when telling Dr. Collett that Cassia was pregnant. It was bad surprise. Okay, the director said and looked upwards for a moment. Your mate. The smell of the blue freckles winked out quickly. The director took a new breath and then nodded brightly to Jude. I will find your mate if you promise to eat. Promise. Cassia had told Jude what promise meant. You promise to find Cassia. Yes, but only if you promise to eat so you don't get sick. Cassia wouldn't want you getting sick, right? Her voice tilted up at the end. The mouseplace handler entered the room behind her and set a tray between them. Jude put a food bar to his mouth, then lowered it to ask, Tomorrow? The mouseplace director shook her head. No, Daniel, Cassia is far away. It will take a long time to find her. You'll have to wait and keep working, and keep eating. Are those the rules? He asked. Yes, those are the rules, she agreed, smiling. Pink foam washed across her signature. She felt safe-glad. So did he. Jude ate. He recovered most of his deficiencies after a few more days and a lot more food, but something else started going wrong with his scent. It began with a slanted taste at the edge of his mouth. Then, after a sleep, it became a high arc in his throat. Another sleep later, a film covered his scent, and a large, pale curve pushed against the inside of his face, keeping him from finding smells. Jude finally understood how Cassia hadn't been able to see with her eyes shut. His nose was blind. Finding the right words for what was wrong was difficult, but he said enough that the handler took him to a place like a med lab. The techs there connected him to machines. Everyone around him had worry in their faces, but Jude couldn't smell their tiny lights. They asked Jude to swallow little colored bars that weren't food, but he couldn't tell if they were safe. Finally, the mouseplace director arrived and told him he was sick. Jude didn't have memories of being sick before. It was terrible. He stayed after lights off in the med lab. His body overheated, and he slept too long the next day to eat food like he'd promised. The director visited often, being nice to Jude, but not nice to the techs. Jude floated for a long time on soft, spongy waves the size of his old hab. while his body hurt and switched between wet burning and cold shaking. He lost track of how many tomorrows it took, but eventually he traded getting his smell back for having to cough a lot. Coughing made red spikes in his throat, but the text told him that it was progress and gave him medicine water. After his body stopped heating, Jude was allowed to go back to his hab. He decided that if the slanted taste came back, he would tell the director or the handler sooner. He needed to work now, so they would find Cassia. Chapter 20. Jude was put right back to work smelling the mice. Each of their signatures was unique, though much closer in shape and textures than people's. Helpfully, most mice had a pattern of dots on their scent that never repeated. They were kept in glass boxes with tags, some in groups and some alone. Occasionally, he was supposed to smell pregnant mice or their babies. It kept him focused on the hope of smelling his baby soon. Smelling dead mice who hadn't survived their tests gave him more urgency, remembering when his original mate had died. The techs at the mouse place taught him words like categorize, descending order, and percentage for how to move the glass boxes on the counter. He built memories for the colors and shapes of insulin, antihistamine, melatonin, and more. He also upgraded from not safe to a more specific scale of negligible, acceptable, dangerous, toxic, and lethal. At the end of work, all the mice were pushed away on carts, and the handler, Mike, took Jude back to his new hab. The hab was small and square, with glass walls like a mouse's. The lights didn't turn off automatically, so Mike had to show Jude how to switch them on or off by himself. The floor was bunchy and soft. There was a reflection in the bathroom. The bed had blankets like the med lab, but it also already had pillows. Jude left one empty in case the mouse place director found Cassia. When he asked for updates while she checked in on his work, she would only say, "Not yet. Wait. Be patient." During work one day, when Jude was smelling and sorting for increased testosterone, the director's answer changed. The words were the same, but her narrow, twisting signature grew larger, upset, angry. After work, she visited his hab with Mike. "Daniel, I came here to tell you something," she said. Then her smell shifted textures, like the rough, scratchy cloth he had worn on his head with the not safe men in the moving box. Jude's heart beat more quickly. "Cassia is dead," she said. Jude's body exploded with freckled blue. Sounds came through his ears like they were filled with water from the shower. He dropped to his knees. The director said something that included a new mate and great progress so far. She told Jude that if he felt too sad and needed sleep, he could take the 2 tablets she set on his bed. He could have more later if he wanted them. She left. Mike closed the door. Jude's scent spun through the colors and shapes and textures rapidly. His throat caved in and his stomach hollowed out like he was sick. Cassia was gone. For always. And so was the baby. He should have never left her. She was sick. Jude could have told her what was safe. He could have kept her alive. He remembered his original mate, how her scent had filled with holes before she got sick, and he didn't know how to tell people. Jude pulled at his hair, his forehead on the ground, his anger stretched all the way to the walls. He finally screamed, then moaned, then wept. Eventually, Jude ran out of flashing shapes and growing colors. Everything felt flat. He numbly smelled the tablets next to the pillows. If they had sleep in them, it was different from the long tilt of the other drugs he knew. Jude found himself wishing they smelled lethal, but ate one anyway. He wanted the nothing of sleep. Instead of the sleep feeling like nothing, the sleep felt like a lot of things. It opened a space inside Jude without walls. Around him, there was the sound of fast air. When he looked up, a giant tap released a wall of water that washed him tumbling to the ground. Suddenly, Cassia was there, holding his hands and pulling him back to his feet. "Cassia!" He grabbed her arms and pulled her close, putting his nose in her hair. Loud, rolling black rumbles broke loose in the air, and Jude turned away to look for them. When he turned back, Cassia was gone. He shouted her name and started following her scent in the air, breaking into a run. The empty space around him turned into Primia. His legs got slow and he fought for every step when Habtech started to chase him. When he reached the biolab door, Jude woke up, back in the Mouseplace Hab. Cassia's words floated through his head as he realized for the first time he had dreamed. Your head makes pictures, like memories or stories. They aren't real. He thought of the water crushing him, the techs chasing him. Sometimes dreams are bad, but they can't hurt you. He had seen Cassia. He had felt her. He had smelled her. Did the director know the tablets made dreams? She had only said they were for sleep. Jude wondered if he needed to tell her that something was different, like the slanted taste. But the idea made him nervous. If he told her, she might not let him have more. He sat still, thought slowly, then took the second tablet. He closed his eyes and held Cassia's pillow to his chest. Chapter 21. Dr. Mira, the research director for Viorex, broadened Jude's world over the next 8 years. Jude didn't know what years were before he had been there for 2 of them. He picked up on months, weeks, hours, and minutes in terms of side effects as his work evolved past the animal testing on mice into a handful of clinical trials. To help him clarify the distances of time, he was given a watch and learned numbers. He tried to think of how many years he had worked for Dr. Collett at Primia, and felt like it had been close to the same number, maybe a few more. Jude still couldn't read or write letters, but his speech improved dramatically, largely thanks to all the Viorex researchers. He worked with them in the animal labs first, detecting effects on mice, then expanded into the lab detecting on human tissues, which led to the eventual human clinical trials. He was not allowed to talk to the trial humans. He just wore full protective lab gear next to a human researcher who would do the speaking. Jude smelled and wrote numbers on a clipboard. Until Jude learned to flag the scent of a sick researcher, he got sick 5 more times. Each time was a different virus, but most of his symptoms stayed the same. The taste in his mouth, the sore throat, the congestion, pain, fever, and coughing. He never spent less than 2 weeks in the med lab, and twice he spent more than a month. Dr. Mira hovered, upset. She told him to immediately report anyone who came into work smelling like a virus, even if it was her. When he reported 6 researchers with the same virus on the same day, Jude had been locked in his hab for the rest of the week. He was scared, then bored, but he didn't get sick. Jude was given a box of clothes every week instead of only 1 set per day. The clothes had snaps, buttons, zippers, and pockets. He figured out how to manage each of those quickly, but needed Mike's help to learn to tie shoes, and sometimes they still even fell loose midday. The biggest change happened after his first year, when Dr. Mira started taking him to the cafeteria during her lunch hour on Fridays to ask how his work was going. The cafeteria had whole foods that Jude had never imagined before, recognizing only their smells as ingredients from the food bars and pouches. On his first Friday lunch, he'd held up a bright green curve, and Dr. Mira had called it spinach. Over the next month, he had learned a handful of fruits, vegetables, breads, meats, and grains. His curiosity and enthusiasm about it led Dr. Mira to replacing his weekly box of food bars and pouches with a basket of cafeteria foods. Then eventually, adding a new space in the hab, she called it a kitchen. Jude spent hours after work in the kitchen. He experimented with ingredients, using heat from the stove to change and combine all the waves of textured smells in the air. He even asked Mike to bring certain spices in more often, or inquired about variations on some of the grains. Mike could usually fulfill the requests. He cleared out and restocked the fridge and cabinet with containers of small cut foods while Jude was at work. Jude spent a lot of extra time visiting the bathroom while his stomach adjusted to it all, and eventually he abandoned cheese altogether. But the months of jagged aches were worth every flavor. Plants were his favorite. Once, the stove had heated a pan too quickly. It turned the meat black, and the room had erupted with high-pitched arrows of noise. Mike had burst in with a large-handled tank, then turned on fans and disconnected the alarms. Jude was much more careful with it afterwards. At night, after his watch passed the 7, Jude took a shower. He used shampoo, even though it smelled like plants that drink poison, because it was a condition that Dr. Mira had given him when he asked if he could let his hair get long instead of only laying on his head. She had asked him why, and he had told her he wanted to braid it. He hadn't known it would take so many years to be long enough for braiding, and wondered if it had taken as long for Cassia, or if human hair was just faster about it. After his shower, Jude would take the sleep meds and lay down for dreams. He mostly had dreams about usual days, but with upside-down smells or backwards doors. The mice visited the dreams too, bearing the signatures of humans like Dr. Collett or Mike, or Jude's original mate. The strange and the bland dreams were worth having most of the time, because eventually he would get to dream of Cassia. Sometimes he just dreamed she was nearby while he worked or made food. In other dreams, he was trying to find her in labs full of people. Once, she was the size of a mouse and trapped in a glass box. Another time, she was a human trial patient who didn't remember him. A few times, Jude got really lucky and dreamt of mating with her again. When it came to having a mate, Dr. Mira had smelled like the pink foam of Safeglad when Jude declined her offer for a replacement. It took several years for Jude to piece together that Dr. Mira's facility wasn't meant for mating or for babies. Although Jude's observation that one of the researchers was pregnant by one of the staff members during a Friday lunch resulted in both of them vanishing from the research labs the following week. When he had worked at Virex for 3 years, Dr. Mira told him that laws, which were very large rules, had changed. It was against the rules to be a deline. Jude wasn't sure how to react, but luckily Dr. Mira didn't have tiny lights. She covered his glass walls with plastic panels to help him feel safe. She promised she would keep him a secret. Then she coached him to blend in with the humans, even giving him name tags he couldn't read, and a card on a lanyard with a tiny reflection of his face printed on it. He tried to use the card on the door of his hab once, but it didn't open. Blending in with humans was impossible while he worked because none of them ever smelled the samples. The best he could do was observe their gestures, learn more words, and pin his name badge the right way up, day after day, week after week, year after year. Chapter 22. On one afternoon, after Jude handed his clipboard of checked boxes to a researcher who thanked him — Jude had learned to say you're welcome after being thanked — Dr. Mira took him to her office for the first time. It was behind locked doors, like most of the building, but unlike the research labs, Dr. Mira's walls had rectangles of colored images, like pieces of memories or dreams. Jude swiveled, curious to see more, before she poured alcohol into 2 glasses and offered one to him. He'd smelled alcohol before in a handful of people's scents, stronger than the little wipes and swabs used to clean, but it was alarmingly close to the smell of the attack that had ended up killing Cassia. His chest felt squeezed when he encountered it on the researchers, but since accidentally revealing when one of the techs was pregnant, and another awkward moment when he asked why someone else smelled like the trial opioids, he no longer mentioned people's scents unless it was a virus. "I'm retiring," Dr. Mira announced with a smile and raised her glass toward him. His best bet was to copy gestures if they were unfamiliar, so he raised his glass in return. It worked, and the director drank hers, but Jude wouldn't take his mimicry that far. "You're going to work for a new director, Daniel. His name is Dr. Peterson, and he will be here shortly. He doesn't know that you work at Virex, so I'm going to handle a private introduction. It should make things easier on both of you." Jude stared into his glass while Dr. Mira sipped hers, wondering what could become different with a new director. Dr. Mira didn't want him talking about his old director. He discovered that in his early days at Virex, when a researcher had asked Jude about his last job. Before he could say Dr. Collett's name, Dr. Mira had cut in, pulled Jude into the hallway, and had made a new rule: don't talk about Primia. The researcher who had asked Jude the question was reassigned. Jude knew what it felt like to have questions but not ask them. At Primia, he could only answer the chemtechs, and only about the containers or samples on the chem lab counter. Cassia had been the first person who let him ask things. Dr. Mira didn't seem to mind questions much either, but it depended on how busy she looked. This seemed like a good time. "Will I still live here?" Jude asked. "What? Of course. I told you I would keep you safe," she assured him. Jude nodded, feeling a little small. Dr. Mira finished the rest of her drink and assured him, "I'll square Peterson away about your security. Don't worry about anyone taking you away. We'll keep you a secret." There were footsteps down the hall, then a knock. Dr. Mira pushed a button on her desk that unlocked the door for a staff member, who quickly introduced Dr. Peterson and his assistant, PhD candidate Riley, then left. Jude's world spun to a stop and his heart burst into a sprint. PhD candidate Riley was carrying a familiar scent. Her own was tall and perforated, with a stretchy texture, but on one edge there was a feathery swirl. Cassia. Cassia! He thought he might be dreaming, but the longer PhD candidate Riley stood in the room without the walls changing or mice crawling through the door, the less Jude doubted. "Daniel!" Dr. Mira put a hand on his arm, snapping him back to the present. "Is everything okay?" Jude blinked. Dr. Peterson was holding out his hand. Jude belatedly shook it, then repeated the gesture with PhD candidate Riley, who said he could call her just Riley. He kept staring at her until tiny lights began winking in a row on everyone's sense. The director smoothed out the room by pouring the guests a drink and inviting everyone to sit. She asked how their flight was and congratulated Peterson on officially accepting the position. Once they had all settled, Dr. Mira began. "I booked this meeting to get straight to it, Dr. Peterson. I don't want you getting too overwhelmed with much else before your transfer, and I had to wait until you signed your NDAs this morning. Daniel is a deline." Dr. Peterson coughed on his alcohol. The broad, flat disc of his signature was suddenly decorated by rapidly appearing, then vanishing blue freckles. Riley's scent started growing larger, though her face was blank. It was Dr. Peterson's turn to stare at Jude, his eyes wide. "Obviously, he's off the books," Dr. Mira continued. "He's publicly listed as a research consultant, and our numbers balance out. His rate covers the cost of his housing, food, and security. My research teams have signed lifetime confidentiality, and they're paid bonuses from Daniel's accelerated research output. Everyone in my department knows the system is in place. You just have to maintain it." Jude was too distracted by the presence of the impossible to keep listening. His heart felt like it was folding itself upside down. Smells could be close in shape, color, or texture, but they were never identical. Dead signatures were crumpled, dim transformation of their living shapes. Cassia's signature wasn't dead. Cassia wasn't dead. Where was she? Had she been with PhD candidate Riley just through doors that Jude had never crossed? Did Cassia work for Dr. Peterson too? The question in his head paused with the realization. The director. She had lied. "Don't get hung up on the legality. His consultation expedites every project we launch," Dr. Mira said testily. Jude tried to catch up to the conversation, but much of it was beyond his vocabulary. "I'm not risking it," Dr. Peterson growled as his scent tinted darker and took on the gloss from the drink. "I didn't agree to inherit a criminal operation, shut down the account, or find another interested party." Dr. Mira's eyes narrowed. "Daniel has made Virex millions of dollars. He's the reason they could afford to acquire Averon, why you have this job at all. So unless you're prepared to justify why this department crashed the moment you took over, I'd suggest you get acquainted." Dr. Peterson asked to review the books. Dr. Mira assured him she would set up another time, then presented some of Jude's latest data analysis across half a dozen projects. Peterson was asking more questions, his body turned away from where Jude sat. PhD candidate Riley asked a few clarifying questions for herself and would glance Jude's way from time to time. Jude tuned it all out, breathing deeply to bask in the faded hint of his mate. He didn't know what to do, except to keep telling himself it was real. An hour later, they all stood back up. Nobody shook Jude's hand on the way out, though Riley looked at him one last time before the door was shut. Dr. Mira returned to her desk, and her scent inflated around her, glossy from the drinks. "Director," Jude began, though he learned that when a scent had grown past a certain size, it was harder to get answers. "What?" Dr. Mira huffed, swallowing all of the untouched drink that Jude had set back on her desk. "You said Cassia died?" Dr. Mira's eyebrows went together and she looked at him, confused. After a moment, the scooping crescent around her scent switched into a high band of aqua light for a memory. She said, "Oh, yes, your mate." Then her signature shifted textures to the same roughness as the night she had brought Jude the devastating news. She waved her hand and turned aside and continued, "Yes, Cassia died. That was a long time ago." The roughness. It was cheating, Jude realized. Dr. Mira was breaking the rules. He waited for her to turn back around and look him in the eyes before he replied, slowly, just to be sure. "You promised?" "I didn't promise she wouldn't die," she snapped, scent puffing out again, then called for Mike on her desk speaker. When the door opened for him a moment later, she said more nicely, "I understand if you're just nervous about the change. Peterson will come around. You're safe." Chapter 23. Jude was returned to his hab, where he tried to make food. His focus wasn't on cooking so much as it was caught in a tangle of open-ended thoughts and unanswered questions. Cassia was alive. That was the one sure thing he knew. But where? Riley would know. He decided to ask her the next time they had a meeting. He needed to know if Dr. Collett still had her, or if the not-safe men had taken her. Had they hit her, too? At the thought, Jude accidentally knocked a glass tumbler out of the kitchen cabinet. It burst outward in pieces when it hit the hard kitchen ground. The sound of its crash was a clear, multicolored wave that turned opaque white all around the edges. Jude didn't know glass could break so beautifully. He bent down and studied the sparkling parts. Dr. Mira had lied. Had she even actually looked for Cassia at all? He thought backwards through time. Dr. Mira hadn't been lying when she promised to look, just when she had said Cassia was dead. She had made the promise so that Jude would eat and work, then cheated out of it. If Cassia was alive, why hadn't she found Jude? She was human. She was smart. Did she think that he was dead? Jude's signature shrank in shame when he realized he hadn't looked for her outside of his dreams. He reached for the pieces of the broken tumbler to pick up a triangular shard. What if it was even worse than that? What if Cassia hadn't looked for him because she found a new mate? A human mate. He had dreamed about that once and hadn't taken the sleep meds for a week afterwards. Jude had become human smart enough in the past few years to understand that when he and Cassia had been together, their minds were shaped differently. At the time, it was something he'd admired about her, how she had answers for all his questions. The longer he lived, and the more he picked up from the humans at Virex, the more he had come to realize that they thought he was like a mouse, simple and stupid, but important enough to keep safe in glass. He wondered, with the bruising of dread over his scent, if Cassia had thought that he was stupid too. Jude squeezed the broken glass angrily. It sank deep under the skin of his palm, and blood quickly filled the line like it had filled vials during blood draws. Whatever Cassia had thought of him, she had also loved him. She had never hidden beneath the scratchy cheating mask. There had been nights in their hab, without even waking, that her scent would flash happy, safe, or glad. She would hold Jude a little tighter. His own signature was growing again. Blood ran down his arm, and the drops on the floor were merging together. The night shift handler hurtled in through the door a minute later and wrapped Jude's hand in a towel. He brought Jude to the human trials clinic and called a tech over his phone to ask for stitches. Jude said nothing, but sat where they told him to sit and held out his hand when the tech arrived to sew the skin back together. Fixing the damage hurt in louder colors than the cut that needed the fixing. By the time they returned to the hab, the blood and glass had been cleaned off the floor. But the shape and the color of the shatter kept replaying in Jude's memory as he laid in bed. Rules were meant to keep things from breaking, but broken things, broken rules, were weapons.